So I'm looking at the history of the Irish in Manchester, and what I'm aiming to do in the overall talk is to look at the following features: immigration, famine in the 1840s, poverty when they came to Manchester in Little Ireland, the politics of it with the Manchester Martyrs and the Fenian Dynamite conspiracy, prejudice against Irish people, the transformation of the Irish image, the current Irish community, and the Irish and Catholicism. Right, so this is the history of the Irish in Manchester, who, as we know, there's a high proportion. I think it's 35% of the population of Manchester and Greater Manchester have strong Irish links. And what I'm starting off with really is looking at some of the images of that are from the Manchester image collection, the City Council image collection of Irish people in the very early photography. And this is a group of Manchester workers in 1848. James Cox, centre on the front row, the sort of thin-looking guy, surrounded by some of the men he worked with. He came to Manchester from Ireland in 1846 during the famine years. He first lived near Oxford Road Station on Mary Street in Little Ireland. He also went on to work on the Manchester Ship Canal in the later years of the 19th century. So in some ways, he typified the Irish immigrant to Manchester in going through those kind of stages. Right, this is Bridget Lawless Cox, who was born in Ireland, died in 1918. Apparently she was known as a saint and a very wise woman, very devout, and went to St Augustines Church, the one we just mentioned, and was married there. And this is a photograph of mine. At the top is my grandfather, Thomas Garrity, his mother, Catherine Doyle, seated with his first daughter, my Aunt Agatha. My mother was called Celia. She was a couple of years younger. And then there is also his grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, Bridget Doyle, who came from Cong in County Mayo. This is a picture of, on the right, Philomena Wright being crowned as Rose Queen at St Anne's School in Stretford in the mid-1920s, good Catholic school. And on the left, me as a page boy at the Rose Queen crowning at St Anne's School in 1954. And that's me, the top left, looking very holy. The only boy I can remember I can't remember the names of the others. I think the Rose Queen was called Stephanie Dooley, and I was a little bit in love with her. I thought she was fantastic. And the boy on the bottom right was called Joseph Pebylski, who was a Polish, and the main other Catholics that we had at school, as I went through school, most were Irish or Irish origin, and the others were Polish. So there was me as a page boy. I remember it well. Wow. And this is a wedding in Chorlton-cum-Hardy in 1916, which was the Edith Halls. Her father was Irish, and it was taken in the garden after the wedding. I wonder where that garden was. It doesn't say which street it was, but it's quite a big family. And also, obviously, with it being 1916, it was during the war. That must have been one of the conscripts in the family in the middle. Can you see him in the uniform?
Oh, yes, yes.
Right, these are the early Irish migration. There was seasonal migration going back to the Middle Ages. The promise of work. And when I'm talking about Manchester, to a certain extent, I'm talking about Greater Manchester, because, for example, my mother and her side of the family, the Irish family, were based around Hayward, near Rochdale. So it's not all Manchester. But anyway, the promise of work attracted thousands of poor Irish families from the late 18th century. And even in the 1790s, it's had around 5,000 Irish people living there. And by 1836, the number had gone up to 40,000, even before the famine. It made up around a third of the working class population. And a lot of it, again, which especially for Liverpool and Manchester, was steppe migration. Some of the Irish who came over to Britain in desperation after the famine, they eventually set sail for America or Australia. The counties with the largest immigration from England were Lancashire, obviously Cheshire, Durham, and Cumberland. And the towns, or real cities they are, were London, Liverpool, and Manchester. And the pattern of migration followed that sort of ratio for quite a period after that. Now, most of the Irish immigrants to Manchester came from the west of Ireland. Not all, but in County Mayo, 4 out in 5 could neither read nor write. And it showed how different parts of Ireland were. In County Antrim, which is in the northeast, it was only 1 in 4, but it was 3 in 4 in County Mayo. The west of Ireland was a very poor area of Ireland. Immigrants to Manchester found themselves living in great poverty, and they were living in great poverty where they came from. And they were overcrowded, forced to live in the cellars of houses where conditions were terrible. They were lacking. There was a tax on windows, which caused many landlords to block up as many openings as possible. And the report found that of the 18,000 Irish inhabitants living in Manchester's cellars, 15% of those slept more than 3 people per bed. Then, of course, was the Irish Potato Famine. Most of the migrants descended on Liverpool. In just 5 months of 1847, some 300,000 utterly destitute and starving Irish men, women, and children arrived in the docks. They more than doubled the population of Liverpool, which already had a reputation for disease and urban squalor, as did Manchester, of course. And the Irish Potato Famine, obviously, that was crucial. So it was a period of severe food shortage, mass starvation, because people relied on it for food. Their food intake was unbelievably based on the potato. There was almost no other food. A lot of it because they were priced out of the other food, or the other food was made purely for export.
It was owned by England, Bernard.
I know, I said that.
They were exporting the other vegetables, like.
Yeah,
it sounds when it's put like that as though it's a choice, isn't it? Oh, the spud Irish paddies preferred the potatoes. It was all these other vegetables because they were owned by English landowners there. They were exporting them, and of course, that's why the blight was deadly. And they were not allowed to survive on these other vegetables because, of course, the English landowners were making profits on it.
And even during the famine, they were still exporting food. Apparently, that was a photo. It looks very strange, of a starving Irish family in County Galway during the Great Famine. The thing which always startles me about Ireland was the growth of population just before the famine, which reached its peak about the famine was 1845 to 52. The growth it reached a height of 8.4 million. It was a very large population relative to England. It was about a third of the size of England at that point, and about over 1 million families were living on tiny farms of fewer than 5 acres, and 60% lived in these windowless single-room mud cabins with little furniture. They were not good places to be. You can see they were already very, very impoverished even before the famine. Its hold on Irish imagination is not forgotten or forgiven, really. Because what's called here on this mural on the Ballymurphy Road in Belfast, and Gorta Moor, the Island's Holocaust, Britain's genocide by starvation, Ireland's Holocaust, over 1.5 million deaths. So you can
the historian A.J.P. Taylor, Bernard, he wrote on this and he called it a genocide. He said it was British policy, and he's an English historian.
No, I mean there were landowners and whatever who more or less voiced that opinion, that they treated the Irish peasants as if they were well, an inferior being.
It's very like the equivalent to
Race,
the
yeah.
attitude to the black slaves, isn't it?
Yes, it was. It was
You
not.
know, it is a form of racism, in terms of the way Irish people were treated.
The population fall was in constant decline from that 8 million high. It kept declining, and this was the bit that still astonishes me, till 1961. Once the kind of, it was a general expectation that that children that were born, would, most of them or all of them, would have to leave Ireland in order to get employment. So it just became a way of life that you wave goodbye to Ireland. You can see why the diaspora feels so strongly about all this. And this shows where some of the worst population fall during the Great Famine period was. Those dark brown ones are the ones over 30% fall in just 10 years. Some due to well, 1 million died of starvation eventually, or more. And by April 22, the population was up again, by the way, including Northern Ireland. It was 5.1 million, but still not as many as they had in 1840. And here's a graph of it. There was, you can see the gradual rise to the 1840s, and then the decline, and even in as it's recovered since 1960, the population is still below the 8.1 million higher that was there before. Shock city. Manchester's population was doing the reverse. It was increasing from a low in the 18th century of 22,000. It started to climb up in the early years of the 19th century. And by the it grew from 89,000 to 40 years later, over 300,000. It's a huge increase. And the 1840s had more Irish-born residents than any other cities except London and Manchester. And 1 in 6 people in Manchester in 1851 were born in Ireland. Because remember, at that time, Ireland was a part of Great Britain or United Kingdom. So they had they didn't need passports. They just came because they were already within that state. That was the only place they could go to that readily. And of course, America, when that opened up as well. So there's a cotton exchange. It's a centre for the cotton industry, attracting thousands of workers. When I looked at my family's background, all of the people on both sides of the family who lived in Haywood worked in either the railways or in cotton. There were the 2 big employers. Manchester, though, soon became not a place where people came to work within cotton, but it became the commercial centre of the cotton industry. And another astonishing statistic, in the last decades of the 19th century up to the 1920s, the Royal Exchange controlled more than 80% of all the world's trade in Finnish cotton. Of course, our friend Frederick Engels, came to Manchester, obviously, and he was a man of contradictions, I think it's worth saying. When he gave his report, in his famous report on the condition of the English working class, he used Manchester as the example, and Little Ireland in particular, and I'll come on to that in a second. The best he could say about it was a horrible little slum. And he focused on the Irish there on their filth and drunkenness and lack of cleanliness and much more. He bought into the rather racist view of the Irish that the English had as well. But what he did realize was that these were people who were so affected by the famine and the anger that it gave about the whole British system. He said, give me 200,000 Irishmen and I could overthrow the entire British monarchy. He also himself had a common law wife who was Mary Burns, who was the older sister of Lizzie Burns, who would later become his second wife. And this is where they lived, Little Ireland. Are you aware of where Little Ireland actually was? That gives you one of the ideas of the cellar dwellings. What I find in the images of housing and even with cellars, is they don't look that bad. It's like any image can really not give you the poverty and squalor of a place. It's much more about how you see it in the thing, the vermin that there's, the emaciated people. To give you a closer idea of where it is, do you know the Salisbury Plum Pub on Oxford Road?
Yeah.
There's a photograph of it by Michael McDowell, and it's just near where the railway goes over, and near the Oxford Road station, that kind of place. And that was one area where the where it was based. It actually had a population of about 4,000.
Would round there have been called Chawton on Medlar?
Yes, it was. It was about 15 acres and had a population of about 4,000. The houses were overcrowded, they were damp, poorly ventilated, streets were narrow, filthy, unpaved, the water supply was contaminated by sewage and industrial waste. The residents suffered from typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis. And it also had crime, violence, alcoholism, and prostitution. And also the Irish immigrants faced discrimination and anger of the locals in a way. A lot of hostility from the native population who saw them as competing for jobs and resources. I'm now getting on to the political aspects, which I've been through with you before, which is the Manchester Martyrs, the Michael O'Brien, William Allen, Michael Larkin. This was in 1867, after attacks on a police van. What happened there is that the police officer was accidentally shot dead, but he's still shot dead, regardless of that. An incident known as the Manchester Outrages at the time, and they were eventually publicly hanged. And the place that it's hanged, to give you an indication, that was the old Salford jail, not Strangeway, which replaced it. And that was just where the Marcaddy pub was. Do you know where the Marcaddy pub was on the side of the Irwell? Well, that's where it was, just behind there, and it's now flats. And when they were killed, there was around about 9,000 to 10,000 people observed it, and it was the last public execution in Manchester. It's not that long ago, really. It had a big impact on Ireland itself, where there are a lot of memorials to it, and where the rebel songs that they were singing at the time were very much based around the Manchester Martyrs on God Save Ireland. But it was then taken over by the revolt in Ireland against British rule in the 1920s, and its ultimate the setting up of an Irish Republic. Then that became the focus, and the whole history of the Manchester Martyrs has by and large been forgotten. The Manchester detective who became known as the model for Sherlock Holmes, though I don't find that very convincing. But he had a reputation after imprisoning over 1,200 criminals and closed 400 public houses, which probably didn't make him very popular. But it's not. I've talked about when he was involved in the police raid on a cross-dressing ball in a temperance hall in Hume, but so I'll leave that. But it's more about his the work he did in terms of the Fenian Dynamite conspiracy. Does anybody know where the term Fenian comes from? It's obviously a secret society, and it was used as a generic name, especially in the 19th century, for anyone's supporting Irish independence. It comes from Fianna Éireann, a legendary band of warriors led by Finn MacCool. So that's where Fenian comes from. But the first in the conspiracy, which was a nationwide one, in I suppose a precursor of the IRA in the 1970s, the first one was a bomb exploding at a military barracks in Salford, in which a young boy was accidentally killed. He was responsible in tracking the Fenian Dynamite suspects, and I think he imprisoned them. Now, what I also think is interesting about Caminada was that he used to meet his informers by meeting them in the back pew of St Mary's Church, known as the Hidden Gem Church in the centre of Manchester. An interesting aside. Though somebody's view was maybe looking to the future, one skilled scientist is worth an army. The dynamite was based on the new technology of dynamite and its uses developed in America. And it was funded and also included people who came back over from America, Irish Americans, who started off this campaign. This is an artist's impression of the explosion at the Tower of London. But the first one was in Salford. An interesting rabbit hole I went down was this became the barracks model dwelling area in Salford, just off Regent Road. And in that, there was a whole load of private houses, but also, and here is another link, the Salford Lads Club was made on that, which brings you the link between the Irish Dynamite, Fenian Dynamite conspiracy and Morrissey. The other thing was coming on, these are the Punch cartoons. Just, if you look at them, they were the Sun and Daily Mail of their time. They treated them almost as subhuman in some of these caricatures, which repay looking at individually. And bringing it up to date, do you remember Wimpey, the construction company?
Yeah.
Still going in some ways. It's some Taylor Wimpey or something like that. They very big in Burnage. A lot of the Burnage in houses were made by Wimpey, and they're called no fines houses. Nothing to do with money. It's to do with no fine. They were using real breeze box or something rather than ones that were made out of inferior materials. My brother came back from school with a joke about this, saying, do you know what Wimpey stands for? We import more paddies every year. That prejudice was still going strong in the 1960s and 70s. The idea that, there were lots of Irish jokes, weren't there, at the time?
Yeah.
How it's changed, how it is changed. Oh, this was another conspiracy I didn't know. It was the Irish club shooting in Manchester in 1921 on the Irish club in Erskine Street, Hume. Again, something I've never heard of. There was a police raid on that club. One Sinn Féin member was killed. 16 of the prisoners were brought before magistrates. And there's a long and interesting discussion about that online, about what that was all about. There it is, the Irish Club in 1921. Does anybody know about this or been there? The Irish World Heritage
Yes,
Centre.
we performed Moments That Changed Our World there. Do you remember when we did Moments That Changed Our World, the Elders Company?
Yeah.
That was what, after we'd performed it at the Royal Exchange 3 times, we then performed it at the Irish World Heritage Centre. It was fabulous. We had a wonderful time.
Yeah, it's interestingly in Cheetham Hill, which is
Yes. Yeah.
on Irish Town Way. Now, the city council, I think, helped fund this. It cost 24 million. Well, it says in dollars. I've got it in dollars here. $24 million facility and 25 acres, and they've just sold a lot of the land off to make a Truman design and build, starting work, 6.5 million, 135 bed hotel. Where did all that money come from? That's the Irish World Centre.
It's very nice inside.
Yeah, there it is.
It's a huge place. Yeah.
It's huge.
Yes.
And there's the land. There's the land they're selling off. And that's an artist's impression of where it will be on the bottom left.
They lost their license recently.
Oh.
That's interesting.
After a brawl in the bar.
Oh dear.
That's really got a reputation. Very quickly, the Irish and football, Manchester United. Whenever I went there was always a gaggle of priests waiting to go in. I don't know whether it's still very strong there. But the other aspect of that I mentioned last week is that the Manchester City was set up by members of the Orange Order in Manchester. Ooh, that's not many people know that. And of course, you've got the Manchester Irish Festival, which is the largest one in the UK and one of the biggest in the world. And finally, Father Ted, which I think is more to change the image of the Irish. It was such a fantastic series. It was a
good series.
It was.
It was a bit of a round trip, that, but it was. So we're down to the last minute. Anybody got any last comments or anything they want to say about anything?
Thanks, Bernard. I think you were unfair on Engels because he definitely blamed the squalor on the ruling class, the way they made it. You know,
Oh,
I mean,
yeah, he did. But he did say some nasty things about the Irish people there as well. You can't, you know, people are conflicted like that. He was on the right side in terms of who was responsible. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, nice to see you all.
Thank you. That was really enjoyable.
That
Thank
was
you,
very
Bernard.
interesting, Bernard.
Yeah,
I'm
thank you.
learning
Was.
so much, honestly, on these things. Oh,
It's good, isn't it? Well, I enjoy doing it, and I hope you enjoy it sometimes. And I enjoy Graham's A to Z. I think they're fantastic. And he can do those forever. There are so many countries to do.
exactly.
Yeah.